Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Coherent Connection. Today, as usual, we have very special guests that I'd like to welcome to the Coherent Connection video series. Nishama, hello and welcome.
Hello.
And Frida, hi and welcome to the Coherent Connection.
Good morning, Randa.
And as usual, Renata is co-hosting this episode with me. Hello, Renata.
Hi, Randa. Hi, Nishama and Frida. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this episode is going to be about a very interesting topic, and it is the compassionate listening. We will learn more about this healing tool, what it is, and how it is used to bring more healing into the world. But first, we want to get to know our guests a little bit more. So Renata is going to introduce the ladies to our audience. Please, Renata.
Yes, thank you, Rhonda. There's a little story about how I met Frida and Nishama. I actually met them at the same time through a mutual friend. We met at a dinner one night, and it was the first time I met both of you. And I met Frida and Nishama during the time that I was studying for my HeartMath coaching. And I hadn't met very many people out in the world who were familiar with HeartMath. And I remember being struck that night at the dinner that both of them were familiar with HeartMath, and they actually introduced me to one of our HeartMath techniques, the freeze frame. And I was really then feeling very confirmed that I was on my path. And I want to tell you a little bit about each of them it was actually about 3 years ago this time that I think we met. And it's just been really wonderful getting to know them. And Nishama is a psycho-spiritual therapist locally. She's also a hypnotherapist. And she's a very wise woman, let's say that, in a number of spiritual groups with me. And it's been a real pleasure to know you, Nishama, over the last few years. And Frida, I know, again, I met her the same time as I met Nishama. And Frida's become a dear friend, a member of, Frida is a scientist, a ecologist, and you work to restore the environment, an environmental scientist. And Frida's joined me in my Coherence hotspot. She's been a faithful member of that, and also in a number of the spiritual groups that I'm in. So I'm very excited to have them both here today. And I've been learning a little bit about compassionate listening. And it seemed like such a nice tie-in to the HeartMath work. And I heard so many interesting stories that I just really felt it would be great to have you guys on and to share with us this work and the connections with HeartMath. So Frida, why don't you tell us a little bit about what this work is, compassionate listening? Tell us how you got into it and what is it about?
Sure. Compassionate listening is really about listening with your heart instead of your head. It's getting the ego out of the way. It was developed in part by Jane Knutson Hoffman, who was a Quaker pacifist and activist, and as well as a mystic. And she realized, and I quote, that all parties to every conflict were wounded, and that at the heart of every act of violence was an unhealed wound. And she was looking for ways to heal that wound, because the wound was causing so much violence worldwide. So there were many peace activists around at the time, and that there were others that were working in the same way. Thich Nhat Hanh had it was called deep listening. There was a Zen Buddhist, Rebecca Schaefer, mindful listening, and the psychologist Marshall Rosenberg had creative communication and nonviolent communication. So there were a lot of people that were working in the same sort of field and had the same kinds of ideas. But Jean was the first one to bring this to the Middle East, to try and get all the parties to sit down together and to listen to each other. And compassionate listening has 5 core practices. The first one is cultivating compassion. So as we all know, you have to have compassion. You have to open your heart in order to listen to someone else. So it's about trying to find someone else's feelings within yourself, and then let that guide you as you're listening to the other person. And you also have to be in your heart and connect with others and be grateful for not only the others that are there, but for yourself as well. The second is developing a fair witness. And this is all about suspending judgment of yourself as well as others. Because, remember that you are also involved in this, very importantly, in this listening process. You look at situations objectively, and you try and step into, when you're listening to someone talk about a conflict, you try and step into each person's shoes in that story. There's a very interesting thing that one of the things they do in compassionate listening when you're doing your training is they have you think of a conflict that you have in your life or have had in your life that still is affecting you, because we hold on to all this stuff. And so you tell this story, and I remember, and I'm thinking of myself doing this. So I was telling this story, and how I was the victim. And so I told the whole story, and the person was listening to me. And then the next direction that we got was, okay, now tell the story from the other person's point of view. And it totally turns you around, because you really have to look at how the other person was feeling at that time, which, your ego gets in the way of so much stuff that you can't look at it through your heart. You're in the middle of it, and your head is doing all the stuff that your head does. And it was a real aha moment for me to look at that situation that in which I thought I was the victim. I was so sure I was the victim, and look at it from the other person's point of view and go, wow, maybe he was the victim too. Maybe there really are 2 sides to this story. And being able to look at things that way, it dissipates all that angst and all that victimhood. And it's very, very freeing. So the third core practice is respecting self and others. You don't give advice. You listen with an open heart. You don't try and solve anyone's problems. You trust and let them know that you trust that they can solve their own problem. And you don't call it a problem either, but that they can solve whatever issue it is that is bothering them. And of course, at the core of this is do no harm. The 4th core practice is listening with the heart. And you quiet your mind and you get grounded. listen for the deeper qualities. And this is where HeartMath comes in, mixes in so perfectly with compassionate listening, because that's one of the ways to get deeply into your heart. And you always do this. It's so important to do this before you do any practice in compassionate listening, because that's what it's all about. It's so many people that are wounded have never been listened to. Nobody's ever listened to them. Their parents haven't listened to them. Their teachers haven't listened to them. Their friends haven't listened to them. They've been shut down at every point in their lives. Their government hasn't listened to them. And this is where a lot of these wounds that end up causing all this violent behavior have come from. And so when you truly listen to someone, it's amazing that without saying any words and just listening, how it can totally change the attitude of the person you're listening to. Because it's the first time that anyone ever did that for them. And it's really a beautiful, beautiful situation. And the fifth core practice is speaking from the heart. So again, going deeply into your heart, using healing language, healing words. When you do speak, after you listen fully to the story, you don't question their truth, but you ask for sometimes for deeper meaning, or you ask for, I didn't really understand what happened, and that, can you explain more of that? It's all very respectful of the person with whom you're speaking, to whom you're listening. And I've taken, I'm doing my facilitatorship, and I've taken 2 courses and hope to take a 3rd course this summer. And it just, when you go into a room, when we're taking these courses, the energy of the 3 days of these courses is absolutely palpable. It's just unbelievable. It's a beautiful, beautiful place to be. Somewhere it's so yummy that you just don't want to leave. And we have compassionate listening has delegations that go to the Middle East every year, to Israel and Palestine. And Neshama had the great honor of going in November of 2016 on one of those delegations. And I remember when she came back, I wanted to talk to her about it. And she was so touched by what she saw there that she couldn't talk to me about it for close to a year. She just really needed a lot of time to process everything that was going on in her head and in her heart. Neshama and I were both raised as Jewish, and so of course we always tended to have that Israeli side, that the Israelis were right and the Palestinians were wrong. And how that's changed. And that's true in any conflict. There's not a right or wrong. We're all one. We all come from the same place. We're all going back to the same place. We're all connected. And this is, compassionate listening is all about finding that connection again and reconnecting the whole world so that we can live in peace.
Oh, that's a beautiful definition, Frida. Thank you for sharing this with us. And I hear you say this is a tool of empowerment, really, that when it's used in any scenario, it empowers both sides of the conflict. And this is part of the healing, looks like, that it brings. And also part of it is empathy, but to highlight more of to highlight really the power of this tool is to explain more how it brought healing to a very turbulent scenario. Nishama, please tell us more of your experience with this healing tool, and how you have experienced compassionate listening, what led you to choose it, and share with us, please, a real life story, how you witnessed that healing being brought to that scenario using this powerful tool, the compassionate listening.
Thank you. I'd like to just begin by sharing that a little background. I was raised by humanitarian, secular Jews, non-religiously, and I lived in Israel from 1982 to 84 and had my child there, birthed my child there, and I wasn't on either side. I was troubled but focused on the joy of being there. And that was my focus. And I had some shocking personal experiences at that time. And what I did notice is that as much as I had that universal love, that a part of me became fearful from some of my own experiences, and I saw my own contraction. And I worked with that within myself over many years. I returned to the States in 84. Compassionate listening it's for all of us. Although I'll be giving examples of the conflict, the macro conflict that I experienced on the compassionate listening delegation, it's really an example also, and significantly for each of us. And the more personal it gets, the more challenging and the more the possibility. So just sharing that. I was led, as a psychotherapist, so many of the tools of compassionate listening were already in my tool chest, and I practiced on a daily basis with my clients, and as best I can, personally also, obviously. And a dear friend of mine of many, many years, Rabbi Andrea Cohn-Kiner, was leading a delegation. And without going into that whole story, I was drawn. I took a workshop here in the States with her, and then I knew it was time to return in an evolution of compassionate listening. And so compassionate listening is a bridge, is a potential and possibility of a bridging. And also as a therapist in couples therapy, and that's like, example of the us, we learn to, as best we can, cross the bridge into the other person's world and listen. And ideally, we begin to open our hearts with our partner or our friend or our relative, etc. In the experience of this delegation in 2016, I'll just, as best I can, highlight. We traveled all over, and much of our focus was on being compassionate listeners and supporting the peacemakers, the Palestinian and the Israeli peacemakers, as well as some personal experience with the folk, of both sides, who weren't necessarily activists and who actually held some pretty intense beliefs. I'm reminded of, there's a settlement in the West Bank. Some of you may not be that familiar with what goes on in that region, but it's a hot spot. And so there were Israeli settlers in this area, and we met with two of them. I'm not going to use the actual names of the parties out of respect because of the sensitivity of what goes on there. So I'll call one of them Joe, and Joe was a very humanitarian. He wanted peace for all, and I'll call him Moshe. He was an American who had settled in Israel, he was passionate about his love for the land and his experience. He also saw the Palestinians as other and enemy. And we sat and listened to Moshe. And it was for him and us. We had to stretch. He knew that we were of the peacemaker, ilk. And yet he passionately told his story. And we used all our compassionate listening skills as best we could, led by our wise leader, Andrea, and heard him. What can happen, and there was, I'd say, a little spark there of it, was this stretching on both sides, leading to alchemy, a possibility of hearing heart to heart. And by the end of that conversation, there was a little spark. Now, Joe, I'll call him, also was a part of this amazing group of humans. He and his other friend, who I'll call Mike, combatants for peace. And there were Palestinian and Israeli soldiers who had come to a place in their life where they saw that all this violence was leading to more separation, pain, and violence. And they viscerally and personally experienced it. And they met, and they had to meet initially quite surreptitiously. I remember even one young Palestinian man who shared with us, because we met with them, he didn't even tell his wife. And yet they were absolutely passionate, and they shared with us, and we listened to them. And they were heard, and we supported their calling. There are many, many people in that region who are called to this higher consciousness. And very often in our media, we don't hear about that. And so then they brought us, or one of them brought us, to an amazing place called Roots, Shurashim. And it is a tract of land, farming, in the boonies, that's been held by a Palestinian family for generations. And in 2014, they brought together these combatants for peace. And if I'm mischaracterizing any of the story, that's on me. But this is my memory, okay? And they brought together Palestinians and Israelis who want dialogue, who want families to come together in the region. And they meet, they educate, they dialogue. So we were there in this Roots, in this very wild, it was just beginning, and they've developed even the place. And the Palestinian family who opened their hearts were just incredible, because it was through them that all of this evolved. There was a young Russian woman settler and these were two, like maybe early 20s, Palestinian young man. And they sat, we call it in the fire, and told their stories. And we were the listeners. And we used the tools that Frida described. Mostly we listened from the heart. And each of these young people told their story. And I would say one of them, without getting into details, heart was even more open to the other and breaking down the separation. My favorite little story is that right behind us was a little fence, and there were goats. And there was a brown goat and a white goat. And they, as each one of these young people told their story, the little goats, both of them turned their head with absolute love and non-judgment and listened. And then as the other told their story again with non-judgment and respect and love. I love these goats. They are, our gifts, our animal friends.
Yeah.
So moving on, we met with an attorney and peace activist, a very high profile. He has a big business. He's a CEO. His family, his American family, he was born in the States. His father walked with Martin Luther King. They were major humanists. Their family moved to Israel when he was a teen and were peace lovers and humanitarians and wanted to bridge the gap. Tragically, this gentleman's father, the one who had walked with MLK and etc., was brutally murdered. And we sat with him. And he was struggling with his love for humanity and the horror that he had experienced with his father the year before. And he was doing a whole, and he still is, I believe, Stop the Incitement. And he worked with Facebook to decrease the teaching of violence. And we were there, and it stretched us, and it stretched him to return to his compassion. He was and is a very compassionate man. In the midst, when it gets really, really hot is when it gets really, really personal. And yet we experienced his heart beginning to open, and ours. And I'll finish, although I have many other stories, so I could go on and on but I'll finish with, we ended up in a beautiful place, grouping ourselves. It's called the Sisters of Zion, in a place called Ein Kerem. And people from all over the world gathered there, and they love everybody and welcome everybody. As we were there, and Andrea drew us together in our own healing circle, because we had experienced so much, to compassionately listen to ourselves and our stories, what we had received, what we had shared. And I don't want to blow it up and make it, bigger than it was, because I think it was a drop in the ocean. But in any case, Rabbi Andrea brought her uncle, I'll call him Uncle Steve, to meet with us. Now, he was I believe, a very right-wing settler who had great love and passion for Israel. And he did not have a lot of love for what he saw as the enemy. Yeah. But yet he came down, he opened his heart to talk with this weirdo, woo-woo, compassionate listening delegation. It was his niece, Andrea. So he came, and we sat with him. And it was really a struggle for him to be there, because he had such strong beliefs and such separation identity. And we listened, and he told his story. And he told his story. And we didn't contest him. We didn't judge him. And at one point, I don't remember the details, but it got quite a little heated. Somebody from the group got a little stirred, I believe. And then one of our wise delegates, beloved George Mills, who is a longtime Quaker, said, in my tradition, sometimes when it really stirs, we take a moment of silence. And that's what we did. And we breathed into the heart with ourselves and with Uncle Steve. And then he started to cry. And he was so deeply moved, and his heart opened to the possibility of humanity on both sides, the oneness. He began to cross the bridge, and we were stretched to cross the bridge. And it was a perfect completion of our journey. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Oh, that's beautiful, Neshama. Thank you for sharing these stories with us.
I really like, this concept that you're sharing about bridging. And that's something that we intend to do through this program and through HeartMath and our work, to bridge differences, to help people see that we really are connected, and ultimately we are one. And it sounds like that was the experience that you really touched into with this bridging, and it's beautiful. It's what I think is all of this, the coherence work and the mindfulness and the listening, compassion, all of it is, I think, what heals and brings us back to the truth that we know of our oneness. So I just love hearing these examples of how it's happening, how these tools are being used in the world.
I would just like to say, I always like to honor where I receive some wisdom and learning. And Hedy and Yumi Schleifer are, she's an imago therapist, couples therapist who developed it, and it became her own, called Tikkun. And it was from her working with, and their mission is we heal the world one couple at a time. The bridging, the crossing the bridge. I have to honor Hedy Schleifer, that was where that term came from.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm just really, just want to say that I'm really grateful for both, all three of you, actually, my friends, but really honored to know people whose hearts are in service and bringing the light to the world, and with such wisdom. And thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thank you for having us on.
Thank you.
I think passionate listening is a really important thing to get out to the world.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, I believe that, because I think that it is a tool that would bring effective solutions, because I think maybe this is the problem with our world, that the people who are in power and who are responsible for the solutions, they are so detached from what is going on really on the ground. And I think that when empathy is a part of the solution, when they could really hear both sides and relate to both sides of the conflict, more effective solutions can come to be realized. And really, this is where the healing is brought to the world, when you can create this field where you could give power to both sides and acknowledge both of them, listen to both of them, and like really bring empathy to the situation and make their pain really heard, and let them feel that I can feel with you, I hear your pain, I have been there. And I think this is where the solutions would become more effective. So this is beautiful. Thank you, ladies, for sharing this with us. I got even more intrigued about this this topic, and I sure want to learn more about it.
And there is, the website is compassionatelisteningproject.org. So visit that, and there's
Right.
plenty of information on there.
Yes.
All right. Thanks a lot, ladies. And I sure hope, I know for sure that our audience will enjoy this episode a lot. Thanks again for sharing all your heart with us.
Oh,
Thank you again,
pleasure.
everyone. And until next time, we're going to say, be in peace. Thanks, everybody.